Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Behind the Scenes Podcast. I'm Nunzi Signore, and today we've got Andy Lyons. Andy is the assistant major league strength and conditioning coach, as well as the assistant minor league strength and conditioning coordinator. It's a multitasking title right there, sir. I just had a great Zoom call with Andy and his crew at the Giants on RSI. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, I'd just like to welcome to the show, Andy Lyons. Andy, welcome to the show. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, man. Let's talk a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now first.
So I grew up playing baseball. I played through college, got to my senior year at New Mexico State before realizing that I wasn't going to have much of a future in playing. And from there, I kind of realized how much I loved the strength and conditioning aspect of being an athlete and how much that led to my success. So I reached out to our strength coach over at New Mexico State and just kind of asked, can I come in and be just like an intern, a fly on the wall? So I did that the following semester, helped out with baseball. That led to an internship at University of Washington the following semester, working with all sorts of Olympic sports, and then took that to a graduate school over at Arizona State University. Worked primarily with football over there, but also a lot of Olympic sports as well. And that led right into my first job in professional baseball at the Seattle Mariners. So spent 5 years with the Mariners throughout the minor league system, kind of up and down through some of the levels before landing over here at the San Francisco Giants, leading into 2020 as the assistant minor league coordinator. So I did that for 3 years. It's kind of helping to oversee our minor league strength department staff as well as our athletes, and then working a little bit more hands-on with our rehab guys in our complex in Arizona. And then this first year will be my first year working at the major league level as well. So I'll hold kind of like a dual title, dual role in that regard.
I think it's great, man, that you have a dual role because going up into Major League Ball, you actually can relate to the grassroots of minor league ball because you've been in it. So you can actually see what's ahead so you can adjust that to minor league ball as well, which is really honestly, that sounds like it was a plan. That's like a really great idea.
Not too many teams have that. And there's now the way that baseball works too is like there's so much up and down movement from the AAA level to the big league level that there's a lot more roster turnover. So hopefully this role kind of help ease those guys into the major league lifestyle.
That's great, man. One of my questions was, did you work with any other sports prior to training baseball? But you said you worked with all athletes. Can you tell me a little bit, carryover from working with other athletes has helped you in just specifically training ball players?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously spent like a vast majority of my time in baseball and with baseball players. So going into my experiences in like the college setting at University of Washington and Arizona State, really didn't have much of a background working with other sports at the time. So it was a really interesting way of like learning different cultures and different other sports and other sport coaches and things like that. So it just helped me, I guess, become a little bit more of like a generalization before specialization in terms of getting into pro ball. I really enjoyed my time working with football and basketball and volleyball, and it really helped me kind of learn how to develop relationships too with like a vast population of athletes and different backgrounds and different genders and different trials and tribulations that they go through as well.
It seems like it makes you just, variety is great. Even when we're training specifically, you know what I mean? Variety can be a really important thing with understanding the athlete in front of you. So no matter what the sport is, dealing with all different kinds of athletes, dealing with the female population, the male population, none of this can hurt in the actual rapport that you have with your athletes when you're on the field or in the weight room. How do you assess differently as well as design a specific game plan for each player? Let's start with a baseline assessment of, say, a position player. What does it kind of look like from the assessment and how it gets it onto a program?
Yeah, so similar to I think other organizations and other private facilities as well, we have our baseline movement screen that incorporates not only just some basic movement patterns, but also some more baseball or skill specific movement patterns as well. Our PTs do a great job getting range of motion data. We spend typically that first day of spring training, like physical day, just collecting a bunch of performance testing data and just collaborating all of that into one kind of document in order to develop the best plan. I think what sets us apart from other organizations and other facilities is we don't just leave it at that. So we incorporate a lot of other disciplines in the organization. So pitching coaches, hitting coaches, biomechanics, analysts, things like that to help kind of guide a little bit more individual plan for a player. Looking at how they move in the weight room is great, but you're kind of missing half the piece of the puzzle unless you also assess how they're moving on the field, you know?
I agree 100% with that. When an athlete comes in for an assessment, are they assessed by the same PT, say if they got reassessed again, or can a different guy reassess each time?
We try to keep some level of consistency just to make
That's
it a little
good.
bit more.
You'd be surprised. I've done a lot of consulting and a lot, even at the major league level. Sometimes a different guy can do a different assessment. There's different end feels for guys, and
Oh yeah.
somebody can think that there's a lack of IR there, and another guy goes and retests them and says, "Wow, this got great," but he's testing it a different way. And I
Mm.
thought that that was a big disconnect. It's good to see that you try to keep a systemized approach of the same guys, getting their hands on guys. That's awesome. What we do a lot here is when we're strength training a guy, we try to figure out what type of athlete are we actually looking at? Are we looking at a more elastic athlete, or are we looking at an athlete that maybe able to use a little bit more muscular stiffness to his advantage? In your assessment, is there any testing of the use of the stretch shortening cycle that would actually help you program? And I'm not even just talking about the RSI that we were talking about the other day. I'm
Mhm.
actually talking about physical characteristics of how guys should lift in the weight room based off of how well and mobile and how well their lever arms and how elastic they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this topic, honestly, because I think that as strength coaches, we tend to bias strength a lot more than we might need to.
I agree.
Having some sort of, measurement in terms of like where this guy falls on this spectrum of elasticity versus strength is incredibly valuable in how you are going to go about training that player. We have, a couple different performance testing. I'm just looking at, specific metrics via counter movement jump and some other testing similar to that. And kind of like you said, where do they fall in that spectrum of elastic? Because it is a spectrum. You're not going to see everybody some crazy elastic pitch. I mean, you might, but
Yeah.
typically they're going to fall somewhere on that spectrum, and you can kind of gear up their programming based off that.
So, for example, we have a guy that tests his counter movement jump is much higher than his squat jump. And we figure out, okay, this guy's really great at using his stretch shortening cycle. How does that change what you do with him in the weight room as opposed to a guy 6 foot, 215, built like a brick shithouse who sits and, has the same height squat jumping as he has as a CMJ?
If you get a guy who's, like you said, counter movement jump is significantly, their elasticity is significantly higher than their strength levels compared to their peers, but they throw 98 miles an hour. That's not something that you necessarily really want to change. Like you might not want to change them from one end of the spectrum to the other. You don't necessarily want to like run away from their strengths in order to chase the weaknesses, especially if they have good power outputs. But if you get a guy who, might be 90, 92 with a good kinematic sequence and good biomechanics, solid delivery, you might end up wanting to like bias a little bit more strength and see if that works. And that's kind of the important, while maintaining their elasticity.
You got to keep what makes them what they are, but
Mhm.
bring it up. Like that 98-mile-an-hour guy. I agree with you. You don't really want to change that guy too much, but getting him a little bit more dose of strength can help him get hurt. I'm not necessarily worried about a 98-mile-an-hour guy throwing harder. I'm worried about him throwing his arm out. So the strength portion for that would be an injury reduction instead of like a 90 to 92 guy where we're trying to get velo. With this guy, we're actually trying to keep him on the mound.
Exactly. You're focusing your attention on some other things and trying to maintain good, quality connective tissue and soft tissue work while still maintaining strength and elasticity with those guys to keep them at that 98 miles per hour or whatever it is.
I talk to a lot of different teams and a lot of different facilities. I think that you're assuming that everybody tests that all the time. You would be surprised how many people actually do not test that or probably test it, but probably let it go to the wayside a little bit. Within the last 2 or 3 years, I've seen VBT and just people understanding that some guys don't have to be as strong. They use elasticity to their advantage, and some guys, they use strength to their advantage. And I think people are starting to realize what you said. Strength is one portion in the weight room of what you can actually accomplish. So kudos to you for that. Along those lines, guy comes in the off season, and we want to figure out where do we start this guy. Okay. So Block periodization tells you, okay, this is what you do. You do tissue prep, then you do max strength, and then you do power output, and then you do conjugate. So how do you test, and how do you know where to start by reverse engineering when he's got to be ready? How do you figure out what phase you actually want to put a guy in based off of what you see on an assessment? Like, what is strong enough?
Yeah, the first thing that jumped out to my mind is you said reverse engineer. So that's kind of the first thing that I go to, is where do you want them to be come March, come spring training, and then just work backwards. I typically will start everybody on some sort of tissue prep or like GPP phase. There's things that happen during the season that kind of leave clues, I think, on what you should drive your programming towards in the off season. So whether that's spending that early off season portion regaining mobility that you might have lost, or rehabbing some minor ache or injury, some nagging issue that you kind of dealt with throughout the season. Things like that kind of leave clues as to where you should really focus your attention and training in the off season so that that doesn't happen the following season. And then spending that time just focusing on good quality soft tissue. I love using isometrics and eccentrics kind of early in that off season phase and that tissue prep phase, just to get a little bit more time under tension. And another thing is too, like focusing on enhancing movement qualities. So as it relates to either what you're going for in the weight room or what you're trying to accomplish on the field. If you want to use a squat, for example, as your primary force producing exercise, and that guy lacks ankle mobility, that early off season or tissue prep phase is a great time to address some of those things as well. Otherwise, you're not going to get what you want out of your later training phases.
When you mention tissue prep, when guys come in here in the off season, almost regardless of what they need to work on, we get a really strong guy. We're not going to do too much max strength. If I've got a guy with a 500-pound deadlift, I don't really need him to lift more than that to throw a 5-ounce baseball, right? We're going to work power with this guy the entire off season, because this is what he needs. And they'll look at you sometimes like you have 5 heads. Like, what? I'm not going to lift. You know what? You're not going to heavy trap bar deadlift at all. We might give you a little bit just to maintain those strength qualities. But other than that, we're going to work on what you actually need. Another thing, as an assistant minor league strength and conditioning coordinator, I will tell you from going and visiting teams, a really, really great thing about tissue prep is that time that just passed in rookie ball, when these guys are down there and the facility's empty and you just got the new guys in there. That's a great time to start tissue prep, because you have much more individualized attention with the coaches on the guys. And a lot of these guys from the Dominican and a lot of places where they actually haven't lifted a lot. So their movement patterns that I see are unbelievable. I have 17-year-old guys who move better than these guys sometimes. But they just, you know what? They're genetically just gifted. They're elite. So making sure these guys don't hurt themselves is, like you said, strengthening ankles to be able to squat more later is key. And I thought that during these rookie ball sessions, that month that they're there with you guys before they kind of like flock out, that's custom made for tissue prep.
In my previous role, where I was kind of working with rehabs and at the minor league complex, I would be training, a 17-year-old kid who just came up from our Dominican Republic Academy right next to a 32-year-old major league guy. So it was a really great experience for me to see just the vast differences in terms of like athletes right there, right in front of my face on a daily basis, really. Just like you said, like we have so many, like we have a very specific population of baseball players, but there's so many different vast training ages.
100%.
From, we get guys from the draft who have been going to private facilities for 3-4 years and they came from 3 or 4 years at a major university and they have a really solid background of training. And then we get guys that they've never touched a weight in their life.
Right.
So by the time that they kind of get through our system and spend a few years in there, those first couple years are typically spent more just building basic foundational strength. By the time they get up, to the upper minors, they pretty much hit that threshold of strong enough for the most part.
The great thing about tissue prep also, while we're still on this topic, is that whether you do have those guys that have a great training age and they've been training for a while, or you do get guys that are coming in that have never trained before, the really strong guys, whether you're strong and you have a great training age or not, these guys get banged up. And when they come in, tissue prep, solidifying some stability in low positions for guys that are banged up is equally as beneficial as giving it to guys that need to just actually learn how to hold those positions to begin with. So I think tissue prep is kind of like when I figure out what we're trying to do with their game plan, tissue prep is first, and then I try to figure out what it is. Do you
Yeah.
kind
Oh
of
yeah.
agree with that?
Oh yeah.
They hate it. Guys hate doing isometric and eccentric work. And you know
Yeah.
what else? It makes you sore. But another thing it is, it's hypertrophy training. I mean, guys get strong in tissue prep. I mean, they don't
Yep.
just, it's not like, it's not just rehab. It's strength training. I mean, guys get as strong or stronger, I've seen, in a tissue prep phase than they get in max strength. I know a lot of guys, they opt to lift, the day of a game. What does that look like programming wise for a position player or a pitcher that kind of wants to get a lift in the day of a game?
Yeah, I would say a majority of our guys will lift after the game. In fact, very few will try to lift after the game. It's just, it becomes all about dosing and volume and intensity as well. You just have to be a little bit more fine with some of those things. And in order to do that, you need to be consistent with it, because if you're taking down volume and intensity,
Yeah, you need to hit it.
and yeah, exactly. So if you miss a day or two or three or four, and that starts to add up, and then you become, detrained, and the next time you lift, you become super sore. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So if guys are going to be lifting before the game, um, try to make it quick, try to give them what they need, and just try to keep them consistent throughout the entire season. And for us, the biggest bang of the buck is training at a higher intensity with a lower volume.
How do you get buy-in from your pro guys who may be a bit more set in their ways at this point? Like, are there any limitations of how you can get more out of these guys? And how do you know when to back off? I remember I was talking to head of player development with the Dodgers, and he was telling me that I really can't tell a guy that's making millions of dollars that he has to do something if he doesn't want to do it. I try to let him know, hey, I really don't care as much what you do. I'm just trying to enlighten you to what you should be doing. How much input do you get from the athlete to influence what feels good for them? And how do you know when to back off? And you see a guy doing something that you think maybe something might help them. How far do you go in trying to help them realize this? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. For starters, I think that most guys, and especially when they get to this level, are incredibly driven. You kind of have to be if you're gonna reach this level of baseball. And a lot of those guys actually crave coaching and feedback because they want to be better at everything. Sometimes it's just a matter of doing it and giving it to them. And as well as I do that this is very much a relationship style business. So that comes first and
Trust.
foremost is developing relationships with these guys, and educating them as well as providing them with good quality content, because they can smell the BS from a mile away. They've been around the block. Another thing to remember too is you get drafted maybe from you spend 3 or 4 years in a university. You have 1 or 2 strength coaches there. You have 1 or 2 strength coaches at a private facility. You enter pro ball, you go to rookie ball, have a strength coach there, low A strength coach there, high A, double A, triple A, etc. You might spend 5 years in the minor leagues and you have 5 to 9 strength coaches over that time period. They've been exposed to so many different types of training and different training methodologies, good and bad, that a lot of them have learned what works well for them just by accident. So being very observant in the weight room, I think is incredibly key in terms of what some of those guys like to do, and what works for them. And then you can kind of once you develop that relationship, just kind of sneak in there and kind of sort of see what they're missing, things that they like to do, and just kind of start to build that trust in the relationship that way.
It's great. It's like a learning experience. I have a pro guy here. He's 6'7", really long lever arms, not the strongest guy in the world, throws like lefty, throws like 95. He will tell you what makes his body feel good. He'll
Yep.
tell you what makes his body feel bad. And I'm going to tell you, as a guy I've been doing this for close to 30 years. I learn a lot from this guy still to this day. I'll give him something and he'll tell me, hey man, I've been here for 4 years. You've been training me. I'm just going to tell you right now, what we're doing, this makes me feel incredible. Okay. Or I'll give him something and he'll be like, you know what? We did that a couple months ago and it's just, I don't feel good when I do that. And I'm like, okay, you know what I mean? And I try to, even as much as you try to take lever arms and anthropometrics into consideration, how strong a guy is, sometimes you miss the mark. You know what I mean? And these guys, like you said, elite guys who have been training for a long time, they know their body and they know what makes you feel good. So basically, your answer was listen to the guy. The guys know what they're talking about. And at that level, learn to read the signals from them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I want to talk a little bit about energy system work with baseball players because there's a lot of different thinking on this front about energy system work, and baseball players don't need to do a lot of conditioning because they only do something for 5 seconds and then they take a 30-second break. While I do agree with that, I'm not the biggest fan of long distance running. What type of energy system work do you do with your guys, and when do you incorporate it in the off season, and how do you incorporate it, if any, in the in season?
We utilize all of the energy systems while we train in both in season and off season, just to develop like overall general health and athleticism. I'm very much of the opinion that some aerobic conditioning is good as long as you're not pushing the envelope on it and trying to like really develop like a strong aerobic capacity, but using it as a recovery modality more than anything else. So our guys will hit all energy systems, and especially on the pitching side of things, because position players just get so much volume in game running anyways, which is a topic for another day. But from a pitching standpoint, like they're going to hit, all three energy systems throughout the week, both in season and off season. And that might look a little bit different for different guys based on what they need. And in terms of like where that goes in their programming.
Like say zone 2 training, like we're working at a really like 60 to 70%, 50 to 60% of their maximum heart rate for 15 minutes to just build left ventricle size, to kind of just kind of build the capacity for stroke volume, and just to help with recovery from inning to inning or game to game or week to week even. Let's just take them one at a time. Zone 2 training, aerobic based training. How much of that do you do in the off season? And what is the limit to what you think is actually too much? This is a great conversation because a lot of people do not talk about this.
Yeah. So in season, we're going to utilize that typically right after a start or right after an outing, or the next day. I think that's pretty general across baseball as far as like aerobic conditioning goes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like, you're outside running poles. Like you just
Right.
don't see that anymore.
Yeah.
It's more, maybe you're inside on elliptical or a bike or walking on
Airdyne.
an incline
Yeah.
treadmill, or even just doing like a mobility circuit in the weight room
Yeah.
for 20 minutes or so. Even going for like a brisk walk, like all of those things could fall into that category. In the off season, early off season, it might be a little bit more like twice a week.
So you're using it a little bit in the in season as like a flush kind of, and also just while you're building a good recovery base. So you do it more in the in season, and then in the off season you do it less.
Yeah, kind of active recovery based the day after kind of a high intensity day.
Right. When they got like a no throw recovery, they're actually working on their aerobic base as
Yeah.
well. Great. Cardiac output. Don't really do a lot of lactic work with baseball players to begin with at all. That is one thing I don't do a lot of, but the alactic work I do a lot. When do you kick in alactic work?
In the off season, yeah, like, mid off season to late off season. Um,
January, December,
hmm
January. Right.
hmm and one of the issues I think in baseball in general too, and just working with like athletes, period, is like you're doing something slow and aerobic based, and they just want to get it over with, so they start picking up the pace. If you
Right.
give them like a arbitrary thing like pulse, right? They're just gonna start to speed it up, and it becomes, instead of this like aerobic based work, it becomes more glycolytic, and it just becomes like in the middle. And then same thing when you're working more like phosphation system, you're trying to do like short burst sprints. Guys just want to get it over with. So
They
then
don't give enough rest.
exactly.
It's no longer alactic. It's like a little aerobic, but
Yeah. So everything just kind of blends into this middle ground that you're kind of trying to avoid. You have to be creative with how you do it, because, like I would oftentimes build rest periods in on purpose by having like, we're just going to do one line, wait till this guy gets back, and then the next guy goes, and everybody's like complaining because they got to wait so long just to get this conditioning over with. So it's like, oh, that's your built-in rest period, so you're actually hitting the system that we want to actually hit.
my perspective of it is aerobic conditioning is extremely important. They don't have to be endurance athletes, but I do think that giving that athlete a good base of low heart rate is not only great for lean muscle mass, it's just really, really great for recovery from game to game. And then building those, like we use alactic circuits where we'll try to make the work rest ratio comparable to what they do on the mound. As like you said,
Mhm.
once the middle of December to January goes, we start getting a little faster with everything. That's awesome, man. Advice for aspiring strength coaches to help them be more efficient programming for their athletes.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think first and foremost is trial and error. You know, if back when I was a little bit younger, I would write a program and I would show it, even if you're just showing it to a peer, even if you're just showing it to like another fellow strength coach, another fellow intern, wherever you're at, and get their thoughts on it, and then go through it yourself first and foremost, because you can learn so much. I learned so much through training myself.
I still do.
Yeah, that I and stuff that I use all the time. And then I think as you get a little bit older, and more experienced, um, you have to have some sort of systematic way of individualizing. You could go crazy trying to individualize, every aspect and building just a brand new program for everybody. And I'm also not a proponent of like necessarily a cookie cutter program for everybody or batch programming.
No, but
So
having a system is key.
yeah, there has to be some sort of systematic approach that's adjustable, but also scalable too. Like once you get to a higher number of athletes that you're working with.
Yeah, I think it's you need to figure out a flow that works kind of like for your type of training. Whether it be, sometimes you're going to work trisets where you're working a hip dominant and a core and then a mobility, or you're going to work lower body, upper body, plyo, whatever it is. Create those systems in those groups so you can actually get that. I think that's a big part of what novice programming guys do is they're always so confused about the order in which you
Mhm.
put things. You know what I mean? And while there is better ways to do things, there is no set way, and you just got to kind of bang around and figure out what works for you. But I find that a lot of people settle in on clusters and groups and supersetting lower and upper body or lower in core or lower in a movement. And certain times that works. When you're working on hypertrophy, you don't really want to do that. You want to kind of like,
Mhm.
burn it out a little bit. So that's great advice. Figuring out systemized ways of
Well,
being individual. That's great.
I'll say one more thing too on that end. Like every offseason, I'm sure you do something similar, even if it might look a little bit different. Every offseason, I put together like a PowerPoint presentation just for myself, of like, here's what I believe in, here's my system, here's what I think, and just kind of putting it all on paper, and I'll update it. And I might update a ton and I might update just a little bit. But like constantly learning throughout the season and just updating year over year, every year.
I call that making a snowball. When you're a kid, you make a snowball, right? And the more and more you kind of work on that snowball and get it smoother and harder, the more impact it has when it hits you.
Perfect
Really,
analogy.
that's a really great way of making your own PowerPoints. I'm constantly doing PowerPoints when I go speak or when I do it for my employees, but that is the learning curve. I'm going to also tell you, talking to guys like you and doing a podcast, preparing and talking to guys that do all different stuff in the field has been such a learning experience for me. Just preparing the questions and just actually getting answers from different guys has been such a learning experience for me.
Mhm.
It's actually unbelievable. Last question, talking about learning. What is something in the field that you're currently trying to improve in yourself? What is something you're always like, man, I got to get better at that?
Yeah. So I'm always trying to learn from pitching coaches and hitting coaches and other disciplines like that. I always try to look at baseball stuff through a strength and conditioning lens, and then strength and conditioning stuff through a baseball lens. I think that I've been extremely fortunate throughout the minor leagues and now on the major league level to be working with like brilliant minds and people that I know if you've talked to a few of them too.
Brian
Um,
Bannister's one of them.
yeah, like just people like that who just have all this knowledge and just picking their brains and looking at everything through a strength and conditioning lens has helped me so much at this point. And I'm always trying to continue to improve that because I have a baseball background. I was primarily a hitter. I didn't know anything about pitching until I got into pro ball, you know? And now I feel like that's a strength for me as a strength coach. So I'm still learning in that end, and just always trying to get better on that.
So I'll tell you, my sport, soccer. I didn't even play baseball. I was a soccer player,
Mhm.
but I know movement. So when I got here, I opened up a private sector facility, and I have 3 pitching tunnels and a hitting tunnel, and I have a 5,000 square foot weight room. I'm a strength and conditioning coach first, but over the last 13 years, I've had 100 pitchers a year in here. Okay. And they all train with me in the weight room as well. So I have 4-camera video analysis. I've got a mocap system, and I've got force plates, and I've got a weight room, and I've been using them for like the last 10 years now.
Yeah.
I can look at a guy on the table and I can tell you exactly almost 90% what that guy's video is going to look like before he even throws. When my pitching coaches are starting to hit a slump, this guy's got terrible vertical break on his curveball. Let's look at his front hip IR. Let's see, does he have enough IR to actually get out in front to stay on the ball longer, to create better leverage on the ball? And you'll look, sure enough, IR. We work IR in the weight room. He comes in, boom. That wasn't going to get better without getting outside the tunnel and working on that.
Yeah, and the same thing goes for pitching coaches in the same regard, just like you said.
100%. I find like strength coaches like you that take a deep interest in mechanics and what makes pitchers throw hard or hitters, move great is really, really impressive. And I think it's a weapon. Pitching coaches who understand strength and conditioning a bit, that's a beautiful blend of the two.
It's been awesome working here and having the experiences in pro ball that I've had.
So one last question. The other day, this is just good knowledge for me to know because I talk about it a lot. Just give me a good takeaway from the Zoom conversation. If there was any, if there was none, that's cool. What was a good takeaway from the Zoom conversation that we had the other day on RSI? Andy came in and was asking about RSI and how it relates just to what we were actually just talking about with pitching. And I told him about how I test the front leg and figure out how that might tell us how a guy may want to land or may not want to land. And I'm just curious so I can learn for my own.
I think that the number one takeaway is very similar to what we were just talking about in the sense of how it relates to mechanics. So just like young strength coaches, I think a lot of young pitching coaches and hitting coaches also, especially at the amateur level, have personal biases and stylistic biases. It's very possible that a natural gorilla, as you would
Right.
term it, has been coached out of being a gorilla, or a cheetah has been coached out of being a cheetah.
Right.
So I think being able to quantify that stuff and then relating it to on-field performance and biomechanics, in addition to the weight room, is an absolute game changer.
Awesome. Andy, this has been an amazing conversation. I love your open-mindedness. I love the way you blend the two methods of performance and actual strength and conditioning. Thanks for being on the show. Is there any way that if anyone has any questions, they can reach you on social media?
I think the best way to get in touch with me is via LinkedIn. You can just find me, Andy Lyon, on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
That's awesome. And you can reach me at Nunzio Signore, or you can reach my facility at RPP_baseball. The website is rocklandpeakperformance.com. And I have a book out on VBT released by Human Kinetics called Velocity-Based Training, How to Apply Science, Technology, and Data to Maximize Performance. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it directly from them. And until next time, we'd like to thank Andy Lyons, Assistant Major League Strength and Conditioning Coach and Assistant Minor League Strength and Conditioning Coordinator for the San Francisco Giants. Please say hello to my buddy, Brian Bannister. Thanks for being on, man.
Thanks for having me.
And stay tuned for the next episode of the Behind the Scenes podcast.